So I got a request on Twitter to talk about how module and crew damage works in World of Tanks, and so this is as of patch 9.17.1, and here we go. So the first thing is that we want to make a little disclaimer. It's a two-pronged disclaimer. One is that the general principles of what we're going to be talking about I feel good about, I feel are sound, and I feel confident in telling you that this is how things are. And two is that the sort of formulaic nitty-gritty details that we're going to be talking about, that is occasionally a little bit more questionable, and I will point this out as we go through this, which parts I am unsure of, or which parts I am not sure of, and we'll have a little question mark, and so hopefully we can fill in most of the blanks here though for you. So the way that this breaks down is into two general methods that I'm going to talk about, depending on what type of shell you use. For AP, APCR, and heat, it's what I'm going to be calling the ballistic method, and for HE and HESH, it's going to be what I call the explosive method. Now, when we look at where the modules and the crew members are in any given tank, in this particular case, I've sort of highlighted this E100, and you can see that all these little colored boxes represent either different crew positions or module positions in the tank. And I've also summarized how much health they have over here in green on the left. I don't actually have a very good source for finding the crew health, so that's just a bunch of question marks when they're full. So the crew are basically in one of two states. Either they are conscious or they're unconscious. When they have 0 health, they become yellow on your little tank window in the lower left hand corner, and like in this particular example you can see that the driver is currently unconscious, and when you use a first aid kit it heals them back to full. The modules work a little bit different. The modules can essentially exist in 3 states, at least as far as you can see it. So like if we take this gun for example, the 15 centimeter gun on the E100 starts out with 230 health, and so if you were to destroy this gun, then your gun module would turn red and it would have 0 health, and then after a certain amount of time your crew actually fixes that gun, and when they fix it to this damaged value here. So when the gun is yellow, it basically means that it has 115 health. So it is actually more easily damaged once it's actually orange, and this is the case for all modules. And if you use a repair kit on the modules, then it will repair them back to full. And so that's basically the way that health works for both the crew and the modules themselves. And so when we talk about the ballistic method, and this is for using the AP, APCR, and heat, one of the important things that I want to talk about is that the sort of angle of incidence, the angle at which the shell strikes the armor plate, is not necessarily the angle that it exits the armor plate. And so in real life, the shell does not follow the blue line all the way through. If it hits the armor plate at an angle, typically speaking, it's either going to deflect out or deflect in, depending on the angle and the physical properties of the pieces involved. Now, if you were to shoot the shell down at a perpendicular surface to the plate, right? If it was directly at a 90-degree angle into the armor plate, then presumably under those conditions it would continue straight through. But most of the shells that we're talking about operate in an angle. Now, the reason why we think that this is the case when you penetrate in through the armor is that we know that this mechanic is already in the game, because when AP, APCR, or heat shells go through spaced armor, the angle is changed between the spaced armor and the armor that is underneath the spaced armor. So presumably that is also the case for as these shells enter into the interior of the tank, but we're not exactly 100% on that. That's just something that we sort of presume to be true. And so in this particular case, what happens is if we follow this blue line here, the shell strikes the tank, penetrates the armor, it takes on a slightly different angle, and then it continues to travel through the tank in a straight line. And any modules or crew members that it passed through has to make a saving throw, otherwise it takes damage. And so basically the chance for the shell to damage the crew is 33%, or at least it was at one time. I'm not entirely sure that this number is correct now, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is later. Now, the modules themselves all have slightly different chances to take damage. For example, it goes from 27% to damage the ammo rack, which is the lowest value for all of these. And then there's a couple more special cases. One is the tracks themselves, which has a 100% chance to do damage. Sort of. So the reason why I say sort of is that if you look on this diagram, they're saying that the green is the entire tracks, but a long time ago a change was made to the game where you could not actually untrack somebody by shooting them through the middle of the tracks. And so essentially what they did was that they made the drive wheels of the track the 100%. And so if you shoot through these drive wheels, then you have 100% damage of dealing damage to the track module. And the other special case is the gun itself. The gun can be either 33% chance to be damaged or a 100% chance to be damaged. Now, what's the difference there? So if you shoot the gun outside of the tank, so outside of the mantlet, more or less, that you have a 100% chance to damage the gun. If you shoot it inside of the mantlet, then that means if the shell actually passes through the turret, more or less, then you have a 33% chance of dealing damage to the gun. Now, when the gun is outside of the tank, it's considered an exterior module, and that's why it's different. But of course, whenever you hit it as an exterior module, you have a 100% chance of damaging it, but you also have a 0% chance of actually dealing health damage to the tank. And the tracks are sort of the same way. The tracks, you have a 100% chance to deal damage to the tracks, but the tracks are actually considered an exterior module, and you won't necessarily deal damage to the hull itself unless you shoot through the track at an angle where it can also hit the hull that is behind it. So yeah. And one other thing about these, the ballistic method is for these shells, is that there's a skill called Deadeye for the gunner, which gives a plus 3% chance to deal module or crew damage. Now, that doesn't sound like a whole lot, but remember that essentially what this means is that you'll have an increased incidence of damaging the ammo rack, for example, by about 10%. And that'll vary depending on the module that you're looking at. But essentially what that'll mean is that you'll get ammo racks you'll deal damage to ammo racks 10% more often. And it also is important to note that this only applies to this method because Deadeye only works for AP, APCR, and heat shells. Now, when we talk about the explosive method, we know a little bit about this because Wargaming released a little bit of information about how HE explosions work. And so we'll talk about that briefly. There's three basic situations that we're going to want to talk about. We're going to want to talk about hits to armor that actually penetrate, hits that don't penetrate, and then misses, which just cause some splash damage. And so when we look at the HE shells, we see that they actually have a burst radius. And what that essentially means is that when the shell hits something, it explodes. And when it explodes, it creates this sphere. And that sphere has a radius of, in this particular case for the T92 shells, 11.64 meters. Now, the way that the sphere works is that at the center of the sphere, you basically deal 100% of the potential damage of the shell. And as you get closer to the outside of the sphere, you deal up to 0% damage, right? And we don't know exactly how this scales as you go outwards in along the radius. We don't know if it's linear or not, for example. All we know is that at some point it goes all the way down to 0. Now, this is important, not so much for the case of the penetration, because in the case of the I'll talk through this. So in case of the penetration, essentially what happens is the shell will follow this blue line, it will strike the armor, it will penetrate the armor there, and essentially what it does is it draws a sphere there, which I haven't bothered to draw in this particular case, but it basically draws a sphere and then it draws a cone from essentially the same place. And so in this particular case, it's always a 45-degree cone that it draws from where it penetrates. And then now the important thing to note is that when the HE shell penetrates, there is no damage mitigation, and so it will deal the full damage of the potential shell. And that's why being able to penetrate with HE shells is incredibly important, especially against more lightly armored tanks. Now, the chance to damage crew, you'll notice, is different than what it was for the ballistic method. The ballistic method was approximated at 33%, and the HE method is approximated at 10%. Again, these were very, very old values. I don't actually think that they are, I don't actually think that this one is particularly correct. I think that both of them are probably around the 30% chance damage range, but I haven't actually seen any updated numbers on that. But I get the sense that it's probably going to be about the same, or at least I would guess that they would be about the same. Now, the chance to deal damage to the module with HE is exactly the same, as it turns out, and it follows the exact same properties as the ballistic method as far as the chance to deal damage. Now, the way that it deals damage is slightly different. Now, for the other two cases, we'll have to talk about this a little bit more. Now, here's where the sphere becomes more important. And so essentially, if you imagine this sort of black line here to be the armor plate, the blue shell, the shell follows in the blue line, it impacts the armor plate here. So where it impacts the armor plate, it creates that sphere. Right? And so what will happen is that the game will calculate where is the weakest point within the sphere to deal the maximum amount of damage. And so if in this particular case I've drawn a slightly thinner part of the armor right here, and so it will draw the cone from that point. Now, presumably the distance from the center of the sphere to the start of the cone is going to mitigate the base amount of damage there. And there's also the amount of damage that's mitigated by the thickness of the armor at that point. And the reason why I've drawn a little question mark here as far as the distance from the center of the sphere is just because I don't know how they calculate the distance from or where the cone starts relative to where the sphere was. So I'm not entirely sure if that's the same calculation or if there's a different calculation for that. But we know that at some point that it does draw this cone, and that cone, damage is mitigated to some extent by that armor thickness here. And so the difference between this and the penetrating one is that there is no distance from the center of the sphere and there is no armor thickness, which is why it deals 100% of the damage. Now, if we look at a splash situation, essentially what that means is that the shell lands outside of the armor but doesn't actually hit close enough to, it does not actually directly strike the armor. And so you still draw a sphere, and it still calculates where the sort of closest point to the center of the sphere is. Now, the damage mitigation here is certainly calculated from the distance from the center of the sphere to at least striking the armor. Again, I'm not entirely sure where the cone starts in terms of does it start on one side of the armor or entirely on the other side of the armor. And also armor thickness does play a role. And so that's, when you see splash damage typically from artillery and things like that, this is more often what you see, other than when you get directly hit. So to sort of summarize what we were talking about is that there different shell types follow different methods, either that ballistic method that we're talking about or the explosive method. And so it's either goes in a straight line through the tank or it draws a cone based upon where the HE shell can deal the most damage through. The other important thing to note is that every module is different, right? They all have different health. They're all in different locations. The crew is sort of the same in the same way, but also the repaired values are going to be different for the modules. Some of them are 50%, some of them are 75%, some of them are 25%, and so that changes like what caliber guns can basically deal damage to you at once your modules are actually damaged, which is why you want to repair things like your ammo rack, because if you have a damaged ammo rack, it's going to have less health, and then it takes a smaller alpha gun in order to completely destroy your ammo rack. So it's something in addition to the fact that it's also going to make your reload time much longer. And then also that finally each module has a different chance of being damaged, right? So some are more vulnerable than others, and some areas that you can shoot at, like the exterior of the gun, you have a 100% chance to damage the gun, and certainly when you damage through the drive wheels, you'll be able to damage the tracks as well. So I hope that was helpful for clearing up how module damage and crew damage works in this game, and certainly if you have any questions, feel free to ask below and I'll try to get them addressed. So yeah, thanks for watching. Hope that helped.